So in the context of beef on dairy, 20% of our fed cattle supply comes from the dairy industry. And I think that's always a number to keep in mind as well, because I hear it a lot from the beef producers that I work with. Well, Dr. Felix, everything you're doing with this beef on dairy stuff, it's replacing all of our good beef genetics. Well, no, that's not true. We've simply made the dairy genetics that we're feeding a little bit better by putting your good beef sires on top of them.
Welcome to the Beef Podcast. I'm Travis Mullenix, and today I have Tara Felix with me. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Travis.
So Dr. Felix is associate professor at Penn State. She has a 75% extension and 25% teaching role. She does applied research in the field of beef on dairy, and one of the leading fields, I guess, when we think about this area of beef on dairy and this influx of beef coming from, or beef interaction with dairy coming from the dairy side. So thanks for joining in and talking about beef on dairy with me.
Happy to be here today. This is a topic I've been discussing for at least the last 6 years, and I keep thinking, are we done talking about beef on dairy yet? And then I keep getting asked to talk about it again. So I guess we're not done talking about it yet.
It's interesting, even from the beef standpoint, is that beef producers don't always realize dairy is a big part of beef production. And they make comments of, well, that's not beef production. And it is, because the endpoints are always beef production.
That's absolutely right. If you're a dairyman, you produce beef, because at the end of the day, when she's done milking, she has to go somewhere, right?
She does.
So in the context of beef on dairy, 20% of our fed cattle supply comes from the dairy industry. And I think that's always a number to keep in mind as well, because I hear it a lot from the beef producers that I work with. Well, Dr. Felix, everything you're doing with this beef on dairy stuff, it's replacing all of our good beef genetics. Well, no, that's not true. We've simply made the dairy genetics that we're feeding a little bit better by putting your good beef sires on top of them, right?
Yeah, and that's the big part is we're instead of having all these black and white Holsteins that are in the feedlot for 365 days, whatever, for a long period of time, really up their genetics and up that efficiency of gain in the feedlot.
That's absolutely right. So one of my first PhD students that studied the topic, her name was Bailey Basile. She's a faculty member at the University of Vermont now, and her entire project was on genetics. And so when the project initiated, we really wanted to say, well, what's the best beef sire to use? And by the end of it, we said, just pay attention to the genetics of the beef sires. The dairy industry does a phenomenal job using genomic predictions to target matings to increase milk supply. But they speak a little bit different language than we do in the beef world, right? They talk about PTAs when they talk about genetics and sire selection instead of EPDs, or expected progeny differences. And so just getting everybody to speak the same language was critical to improving those genetic selections we were making early in the beef on dairy industry.
Give your cattle platinum protection with Virbac's new Bovagen Platinum vaccines. These 4 vaccines deliver quality protection against respiratory and reproductive diseases in the vaccine combinations you need to protect cattle at every life stage. Bovagen Platinum vaccines are comprehensive and safe, have consistent supply made in the United States, and are backed by a 6-month guarantee in the Bovagen Platinum Protection Program. Start your platinum protection at us.virbac.com/platinum protection or contact your Virbac representative.
So how do you work from your extension side, and we'll get into the research standpoint of what you're doing, but how do you work with the dairy producers on selection of those sires of, what's the, best end product for them to select for?
Well, initially the conversations were, how are you selecting your sires now? And in fact, I did a survey on this with UConn to University of Connecticut, Dr. Sarah Reed and Dr. Kirsten Gravani, to say, what are dairy producers doing now? How are they selecting their genetics now? And ours wasn't the only one. There was an extension survey done in California and Wisconsin around the same time. And the reality is, the dairymen weren't coming to extension for those answers, right? We could go out and we could tell them, hey, you should use these EPDs, but they were relying, and they still rely on the genetics companies to make those decisions. And so Bailey's research that I mentioned, we spent 5 years saying which is the best bull and how should we choose them. And at the end of the day, the genetics companies choose the bull, and they've got some really good ones in the lineup now. So I think we started this progression of beef on dairy research asking those genetics questions, and I think they've been answered. I think we're there. I think we have really good genetics being supplied now by the semen companies. If you look at the National Association of Animal Breeders stats, they're producing 1.5 million straws of their heterospermic beef semen every year that are going into dairy herds, and they've got that. They're focused on the terminal characteristics, right? Which is what we said in our research. It doesn't really matter the bull. What matters is the characteristics that we're trying to improve on. The Holstein's a flat-muscled breed. We're trying to make beef out of a flat-muscled breed. We need something that adds ribeye area, that adds yearling weight, that adds that hot carcass yield.
Yeah, a little more roundness to that muscle is way too flat muscled, and so you're seeing. Initially you saw a lot of these beef on dairy that you still could easily pick up that they're dairy because they're still flat muscled.
Right. Yeah.
Now it's getting a little harder to pick some of those up. They're looking a lot more beef animals than they did, 5-10 years ago.
That's right. And it's that focus and that, when everybody says, oh, they looked a little narrow. Well, I don't want to curse on your podcast unless I'm allowed to, Travis, but I always call them the narrow ass Angus, right? There are some Angus that just have no butt to them.
Yep.
And my graduate students joke with me because I'm like, I like a big butt. And if you look at the data out of Texas, that's what Dale Werner's group would say, increase that value in the round. And when you talk about a round animal, what are we looking at? We're looking at that hind end. And I think that's what the industry has moved towards, that's helped improve that visual aspect.
No, that's good. So let's get into what you're doing at Penn State with your studies and your research. And so, how has everything changed in the last 5 years of, we just talked about genetics, but from the growth standpoint and feeding standpoint, how has everything changed the last 5 years?
Yeah, so we are shifted away from picking the sires. We're letting the semen companies handle that, and they're doing a bang-up job of it. So my research shift has focused and emphasized two different veins. One that I work on with, both of them that I work on with Dr. Melissa Cantor, who's a calf specialist here at Penn State. Prior to working with me, she was always really interested in health. So we just published 2 papers this year on the impacts of bovine respiratory disease at a young age in these beef on dairy progeny, how it impacts the carcass characteristics. And that was conducted by our PhD student, Ingrid Fernandez. That was part of our master's project. And now we're moving into the impacts of early life nutrition. So in our BRD work, we found out these calves can be impacted at 60 days of age with an insult that's going to ultimately end up messing up their marbling characteristics, how much of that fat they're going to deposit in their meat. And so now we think that nutrition during that phase is just as equally as critical, and that's the vein we're headed into.
Yeah, I've always wondered about that some of these calf ranches, are they dictating performance to the feedlot and either positively setting them up or having a massive negative of causing some of this, increase in liver abscesses, et cetera. And, I know feedlots out on the western end here, they do not want beef on dairy steers because of some of the sickness issues. And so is that associated with that? They're still trying to manage some of these calves as dairy calves, and are they pushing them too hard? Are they causing rumen, issues, upsets that are causing some of these issues down the road?
Or are they starving them, Travis? If you think about how we manage a beef calf, right? We let it eat milk ad libitum from mama as much as she will make. And if the calf eats more, mammalogy tells she'll make a little bit more, right? We even come after those calves in a lot of our circumstances with some starter grain and get them moving. And we do all that because we believe that'll make a better quality carcass at the end, and that's what we're focused on. We just need to shift the calf ranches to focusing on that quality of carcass. And in order to do that, we need the data to say that it matters, right? Because right now, that's what we're lacking. We have very few studies, longitudinal studies from birth all the way to slaughter, to convince those calf ranches that they need to be making a difference because they are impacting that carcass that early.
Yeah, and I've even heard our dairy guys, they don't care, right? Because it leaves their place. They're just breeding, they're getting that extra
It's going
money,
to
and they
become
don't.
somebody else's problem. Yeah.
Exactly. And so, but it is the problem of the whole industry when you think of it that wholly, right? Is that it needs to be fixed, and there's challenges and there are problems there. And I think you're right. It's at the calf stage that's causing some of those.
Yeah, and part of the challenge is just the segmentation of our industry, right? I mean, we don't send things to the stockyards to be finished by the packer anymore. We ship them from the dairy to the wet calf ranch, and we ship them from the wet calf ranch to the grower ranch, and then we ship them from the grower ranch to the feedlot, and then whatever makes it to the packer, well, then that's their problem, right? I think there's a lot of opportunity, and you see this in the industry shifts. There are folks that are taking advantage of this now, but there's a lot of opportunity for beef on dairy to be tracked throughout the system, to get those data back and to make improvements system wide.
So how do we go? We need the studies, and you guys have published some stuff here recently, and so I think other groups are probably looking at this as well. But how do we go forward with getting that data out there and changing the management of those calves across the board?
The biggest challenge, Travis, is the generational interval of cattle, right? I mean, I own, in Bailey's research, we owned the pregnancy, right? We chose the semen to put into that cow, and so we owned the pregnancy. Well, it's 9 months until she has that calf. It's 9 months before that calf enters the feedlot. It's another 4 or 5 months before it enters the packer. And I mean, Rome wasn't built in a day, but when you start talking about that kind of generational interval, there's a reason that biology has always used chick assays to study things that it wants a quick answer for, right? They've never used calf assays. And so now we're trying to do some calf assays, and they take a long time. Getting the industry to function together with the researchers, I think, is critical. Because I work in extension, I don't have a primary research appointment. I always say industry is often ahead of academic research because they can just move a lot quicker, right? They cut through a lot of red tape and they can move a lot quicker. But there's a lot of advantages in having a research scientist involved from an experimental design standpoint, making sure that there aren't any confounding issues in the data sets and these kinds of things. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity in this space for collaboration between industry and academia to get the data that is necessary and to get it out there quickly.
No, I agree. And it's unfortunately, universities sometimes deal with too small sample sizes, right? And that's one reason why we move too slow is that, but we also have quality control, right? And so many times these industry sponsored studies, they're confounded. And you're like, it takes away from that. And where university studies, we take all that out. It does take slower time to get it out, but at least the data is clean.
That's right. I think by working together, there could be a lot of potential benefits.
So outside of the calf endpoint, what other things do we need to be focused on, or do we need to know moving forward with improving the efficiencies?
Well, I think there's a lot of opportunities throughout the supply chain to investigate what impacts health and stressors are having on these animals. I mentioned Ingrid's bovine respiratory disease work. That bovine respiratory disease that we tracked in that particular study, we really only diagnosed it once at weaning, which is when these calves typically get bovine respiratory disease in their lives. They're going to break 4 days after weaning, which is when we confirmed the cases that we evaluated. And that one incidence of bovine respiratory disease had an impact on carcass characteristics. So you talk about confounding. We kept everything else the same, right? The calves were all fed the same, managed the same, shipped the same grower yard. Everything else was identical. And I think when we think about this in a commercial system, that's just not reality. BRD is one stressor. Then those calves are shipped. Then they've got feed transitions. And this blows my mind. We spent decades trying to figure out how to transition beef cattle from pasture to grain in the feedlot without screwing them up, right? And now we know we go low and slow, 21 to 28 days to make that transition. And a lot of people try and shorten it up, and it's often a disaster, right?
Right. Right.
But yet we'll take these calves out of a calf hutch and we'll throw them in a grow yard. We'll throw whatever down in front of them, and we expect them to make their own transitions when they don't even have a fully developed rumen yet.
No.
And so I think going back to some of that core literature and saying, okay, this is what we know about feedlot transitions. How could we apply this to calf transitions? This is what we know about dairy heifer calves making a transition or having a stressful event and how it impacts later in life. We know that we can screw dairy heifer calves up if we transition them poorly or feed them poorly. We know that affects subsequent lactations. Why would we think that doesn't affect meat quality? So going back into the literature and saying, okay, how do we use this stuff to help drive our next experiment, right? To drive us forward.
Do you think, we lack a lot of studies on rumen development from the early age time point. And on the beef side, we never really worry too much about it because the calf is, 200 plus days before we start making transitions. On this standpoint, we don't have that luxury, right? And so do you think, and those studies are expensive studies because we're harvesting animals, et cetera. And that's one reason why there hasn't been a lot of studies like this. But do you think, talking about going back to the core foundation study that we know is we also need to step back and maybe study some of these again at some of these younger aged animals to see where we need to make improvements at?
I think you hit the nail on the head, Travis. I mean, I was shocked when I started to look into, I actually bought the Dairy NASM, right? When it came out in 2021, I bought a copy as a beef cattle nutritionist. I was like, this feels wrong, but I'm going to do it because I want to figure out what they know about these young calves, right?
Yep.
And I went in and you flipped to chapter 10 of the Dairy NASM, which is supposed to be like post-weaning management and how much protein does the calf need? How much energy does the calf need to develop a functional rumen, right?
Right.
There's like 5 studies. I mean, that is the shortest chapter in the Dairy NASM. And oh, by the way, it stops when that calf is about 250 pounds. And the beef NASM doesn't pick up until that calf is 450 pounds. So when I look at that, when you talk to me about rumen development, I see this huge black box around rumen development in general, and then particularly around beef on dairy when we throw that into the mix.
Yeah, it definitely is, I think, the big missing spot here that we need a lot more studies focused on rumen development, especially with the beef on dairy. And even from the beef standpoint, I think there's plenty of room of more understanding of that. But we do have a big buffer. But I think there's plenty of room for a lot of studies just focused on rumen development in early on in calves.
You go back to our conversation about genetics, right? Everything that we're going to learn from these beef on dairy calves is ultimately going to push the beef industry forward. We had a meeting in 48th Discover Conference of ADSA was held. It was all about beef on dairy. And Chad Deckow, who is a dairy geneticist, came and spoke. And he said, this is only going to shorten up the genetic lag that we have experienced with beef cattle relative to dairy. You think about that, right? We use natural services beef cattle industry. Always have, probably always will. It's an expense thing. It's a facilities thing. It's a herd size thing. Natural service works for the beef industry. But relative to the dairy, it slows us down, right? We can't make as rapid advancements in genetic progress. We're going to start to make more rapid advancements in genetic progress because we're using beef genetics in dairy animals and we get those data back quicker. The same will happen if we start to make improvements in how much protein should these calves get at 250 pounds, right? We will start to make much more rapid advancements in how we feed beef genetics because we're advancing these beef on dairy genetics with the same goals in mind, right? Carcass yield and carcass value.
Yeah, even, in early wean scenarios on beef operations at early wean every year, you're taking something that's 90 plus days old and early weaning it, and we still don't have a good handle on some of that. And that's done every year in some operations, and sometimes it's due to drought, whatever. And so there's still, I think you're right, is the need is there, and it will increase the efficiency on the beef side of understanding that coming from the beef on dairy standpoint.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So in the next 5 years, what are we looking at? What's the changes that you see that need to happen, or what does the beef on dairy industry look like in the next 5 years?
There are already parts of the beef on dairy industry that are becoming what I would call vertically integrated, right? Where we're starting to manage it as a holistic system as opposed to the disintegrated system or the less integrated system I mentioned earlier. And I think we'll continue to see that through its evolution. Particularly, I know nobody likes to talk about labeling, right, or tracking animals, but if there becomes some type of a label or a branded program for animals that can be tracked from birth all the way to slaughter, these will make perfect sense for that system, right? They're the perfect model for that. And so I think we'll see that evolution occur as we move down this path. I hope along with that, we also gather the data to feed them, make them more efficient, help them grow bigger and better carcasses so that we are part of the solution to the food insecurity that faces not only our nation, but others as well.
Yeah, as one challenge for I see on, especially for producers that are not Holstein, is there's I don't know what the percent of Jersey cows in the United States are, but especially out here in the Pacific Northwest, that's a high percent of cows that are Jersey cross, and those beef on dairy jerseys do not. I mean, that's still a Jersey. No matter what you do to it, it's still a Jersey. And so that's, I think, one of the largest challenges is, beef on dairy with Holsteins work great. It doesn't work with some of the other dairy breeds.
It's interesting you say that, Travis, because beef on dairy actually started with Jersey.
I know it.
So, I mean, when we go back to the early 2000s, it was Wolf Cattle Company trying to improve some Jersey genetics, right? And I think that still works. I mean, you can get a good Jersey Limousine cross, and Wolf did it for years. But again, they built it off an integrated model, right? And they built it almost because the industry forced their hand by devaluing the Jersey bull calf. Well, now we have the opportunity here to do the same thing, to say, okay, right now, there's a supply and demand issue in the cattle market, along a supply issue. There's no demand issue. That's because there's plenty of demand for what we produce. There's a little bit of a supply issue, but I do think that moving forward, that supply is not going to go away. Beef on dairy is here to stay, so let's be clear about that. What I think might shift is, okay, you've got Jersey genetics. Hey, we figured out what the best genetics are to use on Holsteins. Let's try some different genetics on Jersey. Let's try some different feed management on Jersey. And again, think of it as more of an integrated model, like Wolf did in the beginning, like Wolf Cattle Company did in the beginning. And Jerry Wolf was genius to do that, right? To say, look, this is an issue. We know our calves should have more value than this. I'm just going to keep them. I'm just going to turn them into what I know they can be. I think there will be more opportunity for that. Right now, the open market is so hungry for these things that everybody and his brother is trying to get a hold of them for whatever price they can. When things settle down, which they will eventually, right? We've all lived through a few decades of cattle markets now. We know how they work. They will eventually calm down. Those models will still have a place. It'll probably be a more integrated model.
Yeah. So is there anything that we haven't touched on that you want to bring up and discuss?
Well, I think the big thing we haven't touched on is what about all the end product value issues, right? The liver abscesses and the carcass characteristics.
Yes.
And the challenge for that, Travis, is you guys in the Pacific Northwest get a lot of issues with liver abscesses. Texas has a lot of issues with liver abscesses. And I'm leaving all that research to y'all because in the Northeast, we don't get liver abscesses. And that's true in beef on dairy just as it is in our native beef populations. Now, the thing that I think, and you touched on this briefly earlier, but I think it's critical to figure out is what the heck is causing this issue and where is it starting, right? We don't know that for the beef population. We certainly don't know it for the beef on dairy population. we know the organism, right? That's phenomenal. T.G. Nakaraja's group has done a phenomenal job classifying that organism, that Fusarium necrophorum, subspecies necrophorum. But when does it enter? Where does it enter from? How long does it persist? Is there anything we can do to flush it out of the system? These are all things that we really don't have any idea about. And I think we really need to dive onto. I think the other thing that is challenging beef on dairy, which is the same thing that would have challenged the Holsteins, is just the length of time they're on feed. We have phenomenal access to technologies as an industry, and technologies that have an amazing ROI. And the fact that we are now sort of hamstrung in how we can use them, and I'm speaking specifically about implants now and limited implants, that hurts us in these calf-fed markets where we're fighting against that flat muscle genetics. That's still 50% of our genetics, no matter what bull we put in them, right? That's still 50% of our genetics, and we're fighting against time. And I think there's a lot of opportunity there, and Zach Smith has spoken about this multiple times, and delaying those implants and making sure that terminal implant strategy is still your focus. But we recognize as an industry, we've given up a lot of potential yield because we've been limited by the FDA and how we can use our technologies.
Yeah, for some of these slower growing animals that need that length of time, it did really limit your ability to be aggressive. And so that was a miss. It's unfortunate for the industry that has occurred.
Yes, for sure.
It's time for our famous three.
Feed formulation software is stuck in the past. Most tools haven't evolved beyond basic least cost optimization. A Diet Forge changes that. It's an AI-powered platform with nonlinear ingredient modeling for enzymes and additives, cost per gain and maximum profit optimization, and real-time collaboration like Google Docs for nutrition. Every recommendation is grounded in world-class research, built for modern nutritionists who need more than legacy desktop software can deliver. Work seamlessly with your team and optimize the way modern operations demand. Try dietforge.ai free today. Feed formulation, finally modernized.
Well, Tara, to wrap us up, I've got 3 questions here. And the first one is, what is your go-to highly recommended beef resource that you tell everyone to utilize?
So I have a little bit of a funny one. I read Feedstuffs and I read Beef Magazine every morning, and that's how I stay current. But when at Penn State, when you get tenure, you're allowed to pick one book to put in the library, right? And I picked the book that I knew nobody else would pick. So Kenneth Eng once wrote a book called Started Out Small and Just Got Lucky. And it's all about how he started in the cattle feeding industry when the cattle feeding industry started, hopping from feed yard to feed yard in a little biplane and making it work. And there's a lot of just the chutzpah that it took to get him going and to start when the industry was young that I really value and appreciate in that book, and that I tell all my graduate students to read, because he didn't get there by sitting on his computer and asking Google to tell him how it was done. He went out and he figured out how it was done, and I appreciate that.
There's so many kids that want to get into the beef industry that don't have the means. That's a tremendous book for them to learn of what it takes to get into the beef industry, because there's plenty of room. You just have to be creative to do it. And there's plenty of people have done it, and that's a good example.
Yep, absolutely.
All right. So what is a non-ag book you highly recommend someone to read?
I thought about this question a lot. I read pretty much 24/7 whenever I can. And I read anything and everything. And I think there's a lot of value in that. I have a mother-in-law who loves historical fiction, so I end up reading a lot of historical fiction. I hated history as a kid, but you throw it in a historical fiction book, I'll read the afterword and find out what the truth is, right? Just because the fiction grasps me. So I'm a big fan of pretty much any genre and pretty much any book, because I always learn something.
So lastly, what sets apart a successful beef professional from someone that isn't?
I think a lot of success comes down to just showing up. I think that's in this day and age, that's about 80% of the battle, somebody who's willing to show up. But B, paying attention. Um, when I was in grad school, I undervalued the resources like Feedstuffs and like Beef Magazine. I started reading them in grad school, but I wasn't voracious about it. I am now voracious about those daily news outlets. That's probably how I spend 7:30 to 8:30 every morning is what's going on with New World screwworm, what's going on with the markets, WASDE reports, like just figuring out where all the commodities fall, because at the end of the day, this industry that we love and we serve is a commodity industry, and knowing how we stack up against the other commodities is how we stay relevant and how we get our jobs done every day.
Especially since you're 75% extension and you never know what you're going to be asked.
That is true. I once had this conversation with Dan Loy before I took this extension position. I said, Dr. Loy, can I buy you a beer and will you tell me how to be a good extension agent? He said, Tara, you can buy me a beer, sure. But he said, I'll tell you the secret to being a good extension agent. He's like, you can never be too humble. He said, the first year that you're in the business, absolutely every phone call you get is going to be a lit review. And he wasn't too far off, right? And you build that body of knowledge over time. But nobody, and you tipped on this earlier, nobody knows everything, right? And shame on us if we ever lose that modicum of humility that Dr. Loy preached to me, and we start to think we're all that in a box of rocks, right?
Yeah, his retirement was a big loss to academia and the beef industry.
Absolutely. It's good, man.
Yeah. Tara, thank you for the time. I really enjoyed talking about beef on dairy and kind of getting a feel of what's going on at Penn State and on the beef industry front.
It's good talking to you, Travis. Thanks for having me.